Welcome to the Visual COBOL in a Nutshell series of presentations. This module will cover advanced debugging techniques that can be used with the Visual COBOL for Visual Studio product. Visual Studio provides an extensive set of debugging tools that can aid you in identifying bugs in your application before your customers do. Just-in-time debugging can be used to cause a running application to automatically invoke the debugger when required, or to generate a core dump file when an error occurs in production. Some of the JIT debugging options that are available to you are set COB switch equal +A. When you set this environment variable and run a COBOL program, the Visual Studio debugger will automatically start. You can embed calls to CBL debug break within your program, which will also start the Visual Studio debugger. When an error occurs in your program, the Visual Studio debugger will automatically be invoked. And you can create a core dump in production that can then be debugged on your development machine using Visual Studio. Let's take a look at some of these JIT debugging options. Okay, so we have two projects. The first one, JIT debug, will demonstrate CBL debug break. In this case, we have a conditional here. If a /D is passed on the command line, it will call CBL debug break. Otherwise, it will not. And JIT error, which is a program that does not have a call to debug break, but it does cause an error to occur. In this case, it's a subscript error. So we'll see the two different ways of handling this. To turn on JIT debugging, you can go under Debug Options and Settings, and under Just in Time, make sure that the Micro Focus Native Debugger is selected. Okay. So we'll exit this, and from the command prompt, we have our programs in our output folder. The first one we'll run is the JIT debug. And we'll do it without the /D, and you can see it runs without invoking the debugger. But if we put a /D on there, it'll cause the CBL debug break to execute. And we get a prompt asking us if we want to debug. And we say yes, and it'll bring up Visual Studio and position us to the line where the debug break is on. From there, we can continue to debug on. Okay, so that's one way of handling it. Okay. We go back and we set the environment variable COB switch equals +A, and we execute this even without the /D. It will invoke the debugger, just as if you had called CBL debug break. And when that's executed, you can see it's at the first line in the procedure division, and we continue debugging from there. Okay, for error handling, we have our JIT error. And first let me unset COB switch. And when we execute JIT error, it will cause a subscript error to occur, and at the point where the error occurs, we'll get our prompt, and we can start the debugger. And it positions us at the error, shows us the error. When you have an error in the program, you can debug it as far as you can look at the current state of the program that it was in when the error occurred. You can look at the variables, whatnot, but you cannot continue execution. So that is one limitation with the error. Okay, we also have a core dump, and if you're in production and have COBOL server and you don't have Visual Studio, you can still debug the application. There's a command called CBL chord that you can execute, and you can enable it, the core dump. You can also use a runtime tunable core on error, but we'll use the CBL chord in this case. Now when the error occurs, if I run JIT error again, you can see that it says that it's creating a core dump file, CBL core. Okay, if we look here, we can see there's a CBL core. Now you would bring that over from your production system to your development system, and you can debug those files. And I'll show here under the JIT error, under projects, we're pointing at that CBL core. So if we start to debug, it'll open up the core file and it will give us the same error as if we were debugging on the same system. And we can look at the current state of the program. There are a variety of ways that the Visual Studio Debugger can be used for debugging your application. Some of these actions that are available to you are attached to process. You can attach the debugger to a program that is already running. Start external program. You can run a specified program outside of the current project. This can be used for debugging DLLs or programs that are started from a non-COBOL language. Start browser with URL. This can be used for debugging web applications like CGI and ASP.NET. Wait for debuggable attachment. The debugger will wait and then attaches to the first debuggable program that it finds, or you can specify a directory from which the program needs to be run, or you can wait for the first program that calls CBL debug start with the correct ID. You can also do remote debugging, where you can debug programs that are running on a remote computer. Let's take a look at some of these actions. Okay, so here's a Visual COBOL solution with a number of projects, each one demonstrating a different method of starting the debugger. The first one we'll look at is attached to a running process. For doing this, you don't use the debug tab, so we don't need that. We'll just show with a simple COBOL program that does a display and opens the file, and then it waits for user input using accept. If you're attaching to a running process, that process needs to be started before you can attach to it, and it needs to be in a running state in the COBOL. You can set a breakpoint and run to that position, or you can have the program wait for user input so that it gives it a chance to attach. If we go outside our Visual Studio to a command prompt, we have an output bin folder here in which all of our EXEs and IDY files are stored for this particular solution. If we start our sample program, start from attach, it's running and waiting at that accept. So we can go back into Visual Studio on the debug menu and say attach to process. Okay. Now this method can be used for both native and managed code. If you wish to debug a managed code application, you would select managed code as the debugger, which one would depend on the version of the .NET framework that you're using. But we're using a native code example, so we'll be using the Micro Focus native debugger. Now if you're using managed code, you also have an opportunity to debug attached to a running process on a remote computer. And you can see here it talks about the Microsoft Visual Studio Remote Debugging Monitor. If you have this set up on your remote machine, you can attach to a running process on the remote machine. Okay, you can read more about this in the help of Visual Studio. Okay, for right now we're debugging on this local computer, and we can look through our process list for the name of the process that we wish to debug. And here we can see our start from attach. So we double click on that, and now we've attached to it. In order to start debugging, we can go up here and say break all, and it should break at our current execution point, which it does, which is our accept statement. If we go back and press the enter key because it is waiting for user input, now we should be able to start debugging through the program. Okay, so that's attached to a running process. The next one is start external program. This can be used if you want to debug a dynamic link library, a DLL. which is called by an executable program that may not be in your project or solution, as it is in this case. That program could be written in a different language, and this just allows you to debug the DLL portion of it. Okay. Here we have a program which is a sub-program. It's called with parameters passed in the linkage section. Okay. So when we start up our program, it'll execute this exe that we have here, and then start debugging the DLL. Okay, so the executable is not in the debugger. We do not see that code, but you can see that it was passed a parameter in the link action code, and then we can step through the DLL. Okay, now we're returning back to the exe, and we're back in the DLL code. This time it's passed with a different set of parameters. So this is how you can debug a link library. Okay. Third one, this start browser with URL is used to debug web applications. In this case, we have a CGI application which is deployed under IIS. So we can point to its start page, the HTML page, under localhost, and then that will automatically start that HTML so that we can start debugging. And when it gets into the CGI code, when it's called, it will stop and we can start debugging the CGI. Okay. So we'll start debugging this. Our form comes up. We can submit it, and now we're in our CGI program and we can start debugging through it. And our output form, and we'll stop that. Okay, our next one is wait for debuggable attachment. You have a couple of selections here. I'll go through each of them. This one's wait for any program. This allows you to start the debugger and then execute your program outside of the debugger, and it will automatically attach to it when it sees it. So this one here, we'll go and we'll put it into a wait state by starting the debugger. We'll say step into. Now it's waiting for our process. We'll go out and start our program up. Now this one here, if you start, okay, it executes at full speed, and that's because this option requires that it be debuggable, and in order for it to be debuggable, the program either has to call CBL debug break, or you have to set the COB switch +A on before you execute it. So now when we start it up, it'll pop right into the debugger. And this time when we're using the debugging, we have the full project over here to work with. Okay. You can also specify a specific directory that the program has to be started in. Here we're specifying the working directory as C:\temp. So now if we go and we wait and we go back here, for this option you set the COB switch is not required, so we'll turn it off. Okay. If we execute our program from this folder, it does not debug. But I have a copy in the temp folder where it will be looking for it. If I start it from there, now it pops into it. So you can control it at that level. Okay, the last option under the wait. Now this is available only for native code. Is waiting for an ID, and I have a separate program here. Okay, if we specify wait for debuggable attachment, wait for ID, and then specify an ID name, okay, that means the debugger will be waiting for a particular program that matches that. And the way that it matches it is the program uses a CBL debug start call, and in it there are a number of parameters. This is similar to the CBL debug break, but you can pass parameters controlling how it debugs. including this debug ID. And here we have an ID of Chris, so it'll only match the debugger that has the same ID. This is used for cross-session debugging, where you can have multiple debuggers running a copy of the application and have the application know which debugger to attach to. Okay, and you can also tell it whether it should wait if there's not already a debugger waiting for it, or if it should come back right away. Okay, so if I go and I start this up, and we'll be waiting for this Chris. Okay, if I go out and I start up that program, there we've stopped at the CBL debug start because that matched, and now we can go through and start debugging from there. If instead we were to go and give it a different name, like Chris 2, and start it up, okay, now we actually get the message no debugger waiting, because we're checking for that return code in our program. So it'll only match the particular ID that you're setting in the debugger itself. Okay. Okay, and the last one will be remote debugging. Okay. Now this can use any of the options. The start action, to debug remotely, you click on use remote machine and give it the machine name and a port. Okay, now in this particular instance I have a remote machine here that I have a remote desktop connection to. Okay, and this machine does not have Visual Studio on it. It does not have Visual COBOL. It has the COBOL server product. So this is a way of debugging in production, on a production machine. Okay. Okay. Now I've copied my executable and IDY'd the debugging information to a folder on this remote machine, and there's a program debugging engine that needs to be started. It's called, and you can specify a port name. Now it's waiting for a connection. If we go back to our development machine and we start this up now, we go back, you can see it says it has been established, connection's been established with this machine. We can now start our application. We'll start a different command prompt, and here's our program, which will start from a batch file. Okay, and we can see now it's jumped back to the development machine, and we had stopped at the CBL debug break, which was in that program. So now we're debugging a process that's actually running on the remote machine. Okay, this is for a 32-bit program. If you want to debug a 64, there's a different version of the remote tool. There's a 64-bit version as well. COB debug remote 64. Okay, we'll go back to the development machine. And that brings us to the end of this presentation of debugging in Visual Studio Advanced. Thank you for watching, and happy programming.